the JLL Coaching Pod, episode 6. Here we go. We're talking about programming, organizing your training, how to plan your training over time. Now, this is I would say, a pretty contentious topic amongst me and my colleagues and friends. How to organize training is always something that you can debate until the end of the world, and it is extremely important because it is effectively how you progress over time, like how your training looks on a week by week, month by month, day by day basis. And all of that is, of course, what dictates the outcomes. Like, if you want to get somewhere, you need to plan how you're going to get there. You need to react to how it's going along the way. And it is what the actual thing that really matters here with all this training. We talk a lot. Obviously, it's a podcast. I'm going to talk a lot. But the reality is, what's going to make a difference with your training is actually doing the damn thing. And this is how to organize doing the damn thing. So we're going to dive into this. A few new approaches that I learned the last few years with regards to periodization or planning of your training. And it kind of drives the backbone to a lot of my thinking and how I look at the human body, how to change it across time. Yep, you said that all right, Jacob. Keep going. So, Programming goes back. It's actually founded, I believe, in Eastern Bloc in USSR. Manufacturing is where the base for programming actually originally started. How to be more efficient with production. That's originally where periodization came from. That, of course, has been applied to the human body, and a lot of kind of traditional periodization for sports performance has been based on yearly planning for a lot of strength coaches and things like that. And it's kind of like you'll schedule out the entire year in advance, which has pros and cons, and like it does work. You've seen when this was first kind of implemented again in the Eastern Bloc in Russia, in that kind of part of the world, they did very well. Obviously, it's multifactorial, like everything is, but planning your training years in advance rather than just showing up on the day and being like, all right, I'll do what I did last week, but just add a little bit more, or whatever approach you want to have. It's a bit more planned out, and that does definitely work. Today, I want a bit of the conversation to be around how that might be changing with a bit of a different lens and modern periodization. How that's changed as we've got a better understanding of human beings and how we adapt to things and how we progress. And it's not so assuming that we can plan a year in advance assumes we know the outcomes, because if we know they're going to be lifting this weight in 6 months' time, that kind of gives the feeling that we can predict where someone's heading. And in a way we can gather knowledge and see historically what other people have done, looking at data. However, there is big genetic differences. There are loads of other factors, including stress, lifestyle, drugs, that will have an influence on the outcome. So it's very, very hard to predict, just like trying to predict something in the stock market. Predicting a stock a week in the future, if you could do that, you'd be infinitely rich. Same thing with training. These are, what we're talking about here is complex dynamic systems. Complex dynamic systems such as the human body, such as the stock market, such as the universe. These are a thing that is not predictable, less predictable. Why? Because there's so many things going on. Like, the human body is a system of systems. You've got your cardiovascular system, your musculoskeletal system, a bunch of systems all put into this kind of skin suit, which is a system in itself. And to try and predict where we're going with different training outcomes is very, very hard to do successfully and to any degree of certainty. So having a bit more of a reactive approach to training, to programming, to periodization, is more this modern periodization where you take into consideration a human being and their place in the world and how complicated that can be moving forward. Things can pop up like injuries, lack of sleep, big life stressors, etc., that we can't take into consideration at the start of the year planning. Not to say that you shouldn't plan in advance, but just to say along the way there should be wiggle room, and the way that you program could potentially try and include a bit of dynamic programming along the way, so you can program reactively rather than being like, all right, these are the numbers you got to hit in 4 weeks time. Shoot for them, but along the way there's room for life. There's room for the complexities of life, because we are dealing with human beings, and that's a hard thing to deal with. So traditionally, through periodization, it would be progressing for 3 to 5 weeks, weights or reps or something along those lines, a certain set of physical qualities, and you might separate it out. So you might start a yearly programming for an athlete, and you could do like the first 3 months you're just building muscle, then the next 3 months you're building strength. So you're working on hypertrophy, then strength, and continuing through the year, then working on power, and then working on speed. So there's loads of different ways, and separating out all those physical qualities over time. So you do a periodization, you dedicate a certain amount of time for each one. With modern periodization, it's more taking all those physical qualities. This is one way to do it. Taking all those physical qualities and keeping them in throughout the year, rather than blocking out certain periods to do individual things and letting all these other physical qualities go away in the other room and don't have any work towards those. This is kind of taking into consideration the human body, and you want to keep a lot of physical qualities, particularly for athletes. There will be individuals, say people who are professional bodybuilders, who just care about hypertrophy. Typically you will just do hypertrophy training year in, year out. But for general population, for athletes, you want you want them to keep them generally prepared and healthy for a variety of things. Obviously you're going to specify the physical qualities that they need for that sport or for their life in general, but you want to keep a good mix in there. And I encourage everyone with their training or with their clients' training to have, as much as possible, a reactive way of coaching people, coaching themselves, training themselves. And that's simply because it leaves room for the complexities of life if someone hasn't slept well. And typically this is what's done with when you're coaching someone. If someone shows up and they are in pieces because they've worked 14 hours the last day and they've slept for 3, you're not going to be like, well, the program says we've got to hit these numbers, so we have to hit these numbers. No, there's always going to be that wiggle room naturally. So this is just kind of pre-programming and accepting that uncertainty when you are making the plan, which is why a big thing that we talk about with my colleagues at work is if you should give someone an RPE, a rate of perceived exertion, or a percentage when you are programming for them. So when someone's going in the gym, you might give them, say, 3 sets at 10-ish reps at 80% of your 1 rep max, for example. Could be anything, but you give them that. You give them exact loads that they need to hit, a kilogram weight for exact number of reps, for exact number of sets, which is more a proactive way of programming. Say, you're going to go in, you're going to do 3 sets of 10, or it could even be 3 kilometers at a XYZ pace, rather than saying you're going to go in, you're going to do 3 sets, 10 reps, at a difficulty of 8 out of 10. You make those sets 8 out of 10 in difficulty. So that's quite a difference. That's a prime example between proactive and reactive. So proactive is saying these are the numbers that you need to hit on this week, which would be a percentage-based approach. Whereas an RPE, or rate of perceived exertion, which is we can just call it, you can use any numbers, but a 1 to 10 scale, 1 being this is easy, 10 being this is absolutely brutal, and I couldn't do anything more than what I'm doing right now, otherwise I would pass out and die. Those are the two differences. So it's, for me, giving someone an RPE and a range of reps and weights to hit is a way to program, a way to periodize training that takes into consideration the complexities of our dynamic systems theory. Like, in the world, we can't really predict what's going on. The example that's given often is Yellowstone National Park in America. Back, I think it was in the late 1800s or early 1900s, the wolves were kind of overrunning a little bit, and there were a lot of wolves, and I think they were just causing a nuisance, killing a lot of the deers or whatnot. So the geniuses in America went out and killed all the wolves. And they were like, well, if the wolves are killing stuff, we don't want them to do that. Let's just kill the wolves. And therefore, we will remove that problem from the situation. And of course, that ecological system is way more complex than that, because what happened over the next 10 to 20 to 30 years is the deers overtook the system, and then all the grass was eaten, and that destroyed like how the rivers ran. So the rivers overflowed, and the whole environment changed dramatically, and it was very unstable because we removed something. Humans think we can predict things. We like to predict things. It makes our life easier. We don't want to have to think through a set of problems, think through everything every single time we make a decision. Otherwise, it would be so energy demanding that it would just be impossible to do as we move forward through life. But we thought that. We were like, all right, let's remove the wolves, and bang, this environment will be better. It turned to shit. And then they reintroduced wolves. A few years later, the rivers were running normally again, back to how they were, and the environment was restored. Now, this is a bit of an example of like humans trying to take this complex dynamic systems and influence it without understanding the full impact of those decisions. And it's impossible to see where a human being will go when you apply training to them. You can guess, you can have assumptions, and you can move forward with a degree of certainty, but it's never going to be absolute certainty. So leaving room for a bit of a reactive environment, using an RPE, a rate of perceived exertion, over just giving direct percentages. Hit these percentages and you'll be fine. No. You need to take into consideration the craziness of life. And there's pros and cons. For example, if you're in an Olympic training camp and you've got percentages to hit and your coach is there, if you don't hit those percentages, we will kill your whole family. It's likely you're going to hit those percentages no matter how you're feeling on that day, because there is a little bit of wiggle room. Sometimes you might not feel good, but you could still hit amazing numbers. And having strict percentages, strict numbers to hit might actually benefit you in some way. So it's not so clear that percentages are worse than RPEs, and there will be a time and a place to be like, no, you got to hit this today. We've got a goal to hit. We've got the Olympics in a couple of years. We got to go for it. We got to push. So there's pros and cons to everything. There's no solutions. There's only a trade-off when we make these decisions with programming and periodization. And generally, I would say RPE, a reactive approach, leaves more room, leaves a bit more wiggle room, and takes into consideration the understanding of complex dynamic systems theory, rather than just the assumption that we know all and we can move forward and everything will be happy doodah. The reality is things are very different. Another good example of this is the internal versus external load conversation. External load being the amount of weight lifted, the amount of kilometers to run, the meters run, the amount of jumps and landings that you're going to complete. That would be your external load. Your internal load is how your system, your body, takes that on. So for example, if you've slept well consistently, your sleep is good, relationships are good, work is good, everything in your life is going well, a weight that is the same kilogram, same loadage, might feel different. Internally, it might actually be different. Your system might perceive it as different on a physiological level to if you've got loads of stress going on, financial worries, whatever. The external load stays the same, but how your internal system might perceive it might be different. Because there's things like fatigue going on in our lives, and that will have a direct influence on the load. So one thing I'll talk about here is with hypertrophy, with bodybuilding, with building muscle, one of the main outcomes we're looking for is a high amount of mechanical tension in a tissue. And that is the thing that kind of leads hypertrophy. It's argued to lead hypertrophy in a way. Again, we don't know everything for certain, but that's how we can make decisions a little bit better. We're looking for a high amount of mechanical tension, which is the muscle, which is the force that's put on the muscle itself. And the external load will influence that internal load, the mechanical tension that's placed on a tissue. However, there are other factors to manipulate that. So, for example, if you are well hydrated, if you are well fed, you might be able to create a higher internal load with the same weight because you can do more and more reps, or there might be higher stability, which is an external load, which is an external measure, something that's external to the inside of your body, but that might enable you to create a higher amount of mechanical tension and get a better hypertrophy response because you're taking into all your factors that will dictate how much of a stimulus that you can create are biased towards you performing well versus badly. So this is the internal versus external load. And internal load is really what matters at the end of the day to create a stimulus. It's why you don't really, if you're just trying to build muscle, the weight on the bar is an important factor, but it's not everything. But instead, the internal load, the mechanical tension, is more important for driving progress and a stimulus moving forward, rather than just like adding more weight. This is another thing. This is why you can progress an exercise in an unlimited amount of ways by slowing down the tempo on an exercise. That is a way you can increase the internal load but keep the external load or the weight the same, for example. So again, these are kind of things that you want to take into consideration, and why RPE might be a good idea to use when you are programming for someone. So if I'm programming for someone with RPE and their body is feeling good, and I say hit an RPE 8 today. Sorry for interrupting the pod. I'm just here to advertise the programs. A couple programs in the link in the bio, in the link tree. Hypertrophy program if you want to get jacked out of your nut, and the fundamentals program if you're a bit bored of your training, you want to mix it up, you're fed up of just lifting weights in the gym and you want to come a little bit more athletic. Dive into the link tree and get involved now. That RPE 8 might be and they're doing, let's just say, they're programmed RPE 8 and they're feeling good. They might lift 100 kilos on the back squat for 6 reps at an RPE 8, and it feels good. And that could be a PB. They might have never done that before. On another day, they might be feeling terrible, and they load up 100 kilos on the back squat again, and they do 2 reps, and they feel like they could only do 2 more, and that's an RPE, and they've hit 2 reps. That is an example of why, if you've just got them programmed to do 3 sets of 6 at 90 kilos, let's say, and they're feeling good one day, and that's a very easy set, and they're not actually causing a stimulus. Is that a productive set? Yes. Could it be more productive? Definitely. And that's why the RPE is beneficial. On the other side of that coin, if they're programmed 3 sets of 6 at 90 kilos and they're feeling terrible, but they've got that program, so they try and do it, and they just like kill themselves under the bar, failing reps on the first set, only getting to 3 or 4 before they die. That's not ideal. That's not taking in their internal state of affairs into consideration when you're programming. So great coaches do this intuitively when they've got someone in front of them, but just this kind of gives a bit of theory to support that intuition. Now, a couple things that are very, very important when considering programming are, and I love this, just like your minimum effective dose for a variety of qualities. To say you've got someone who just wants to get a bit fitter, you want to challenge the general systems that we consider for a fit person. Cardiovascular, musculoskeletal, your tendon health, like all of these things, you want to work on those. You want to drip in, keep a minimum effective dose throughout their training cycle so they can maintain these physical qualities or improve them over time. Minimum effective dose, that's something you can figure out. The minimum effective dose, the minimum number of internal load to create a stimulus over time so that they can continue to improve or maintain. Minimum effective dose could be the minimum effective dose to maintain or to progress, depending on where they are in their life and what they're kind of pushing for. This is something you can play with. This is something you'll figure out over time. You can have your assessments and enable them to dictate the decisions you make. Constantly assessing, and each set in itself is a sort of assessment. Each rep even. How did that feel compared to last week? How did that feel? How are you generally feeling? Did that weight feel easy? Cool. Let's push. If that's the best thing to do, or do we save that energy for next week? This is part of this conversation about programming and the decisions you'll have to make. I'm trying to give a few principles here rather than just being like, this is what the best program is. Well, that's an impossible thing to do. On the other end of it, when someone is pushing pretty hard for one physical quality, say a bodybuilder, they want to be probably closer towards this maximum recoverable volume, and this will kind of you can undulate this, you can vary this over time between the minimum effective dose and the maximum recoverable volume for different physical qualities over time, and you'll get different outcomes. And that's a really fantastic way to program, in my opinion. Start at the minimum effective dose, so you're getting a stimulus based on your assessments. They're improving week on week, sets and things like that. Maybe not week on week, but it could be bi-weekly, every other week. We're just looking to see how they are reacting to the training. And you want to do, are they getting too fatigued? Are they constantly getting sick? Are they constantly getting niggles? Are they constantly getting hurt? Okay, maybe the stimulus is too high. Maybe we need to bring that down and manage it across time. And you might get a sense that this is getting slightly complicated. And the truth is, there are a lot of factors to consider when training someone. There's a lot of thoughts that should go into it, and ideally you do this thinking away from actual training sessions, so when you're in there you have a set of rules and principles that you follow by. So for example, this is actually why RPE is very valuable, because it kind of takes away a lot of the decision making off on your feet. You can just say to someone, all right, make this set an 8 out of 10 difficulty for you, and that solves all the problems of meeting them where they're at, meeting them where their kind of current system is at. Are they too fatigued to manage it? Are they feeling good? It answers both those problems. So it's a great principle to apply and removes a lot of the challenges. Of course, the limiting factor with the RPE is, what is an 8 out of 10 difficulty? How should that feel like? And if you're an experienced lifter, you should know that, and you should know what that should look like. Not just for lifting, but for running, for everything. You should know what that kind of looks like. And that's a skill, and you'll develop that over time. Still important to make everything challenging enough so that you are actually progressing. You will not progress if you're not challenging your current systems. You might also not progress if you're challenging them too much. So it's a fine line, it's a fine balance. And again, your constant assessments will make that clear. The easiest way to think about it is lifting, because it's just so quantitative and you can have exact numbers. If you standardize the rep range and the technique, it's very easy to manage, like, all right, that's a good rep, that's not a good rep, all right, this rep's the same as last week's rep and the weight is slightly heavier. This assessment is telling me you've progressed. Your system can manage more, and it may be felt the rate of perceived exertion might have been easier and you've lifted more weight. That tells me the training is going well and you're progressing and you're moving forward, which is what we're looking for. So there's a lot in this conversation, and it is kind of this first little introduction to periodization and programming, and you can probably get a sense of how it is slightly complicated, and there's a lot of things to consider. The last thing I'm going to touch on is progressive overload. So when I first started training, people were talking about progressive overload being you have to add something each week, and that is progressive overload. Giving them more weight or more reps or more meters to run, that being the progressive overload. And I start to think about it now as the progressive overload comes from the system getting better and being able to manage more, rather than this external load of me saying, let's do a bit more this week. That is the ability to do more this week, the ability to progressive overload comes from the adaptations that your body's made, rather than me giving you extra weight to lift. Your system is able to lift more weight because of the history of programming, because of the history of training, giving you a stimulus to enable you to lift more weight. So progressive overload is something that's more, you earn the right to lift more weights because you've changed your system. And when I'm talking about this, it makes me think of homeostatic versus allostatic systems. Now, homeostasis is probably something we all learned in biology in school, and it's like there is this set of conditions that our body needs to be in at all times, and if it's not, our body will react to kind of go back to that middle homeostatic point. Allostasis is a kind of the next step of this homeostatic approach. So homeostasis is kind of us humans being very highly predictive orientated. We're saying, hey, look, listen, you, good sir, are going to be lifting this weight in 6 weeks' time. Your system's going to be stable at this certain point. But the reality is, physiologically and internally within your system, is your body actually makes predictions and assumptions based on certain conditions that will dictate where your system needs to be at in the future. So it's like you lift these weights today and your body predicts that in the future you need to be further adapted to lift more weights moving forward. You predict if you consistently tell the system you need to lift this much weight over time, it will start to predict that you need to lift more weight as you continue forward. Great example of this is if you drink coffee at the same cafe every morning, your system will start to react and have this predicting influence of the caffeine before you drink the coffee. So you will have this higher energy, the same reaction that you get from drinking caffeine before you actually drink the caffeine. Your body is reactive, allostatic to the drinking of coffee before you actually do it. So your body starts to become predictive. That's the kind of essence of it. I will dive into this further on other podcasts. I know there was a lot and I just kind of touched on a few things here rather than going so deep on anything in particular, but I hope you got a few thoughts for you to take and lead off with. Let me know if you have any questions. I hope you have a good day and enjoy training.